50 million people died in 2 years. One weather pattern killed them all. In 1877, a patch of the Pacific Ocean got a few degrees warmer than usual. That was enough. Monsoons failed, crops dried up, grain reserves vanished. And then people started dying across India, China, Brazil, and Africa, all at once. We are going to cover how it happened, why it could happen again, and what a new super El Niño forming right now actually means for the world you live in. If you find this valuable, subscribe. It helps more than you know. Prepare yourselves. We begin. Picture the Pacific Ocean. It stretches nearly halfway around the entire planet. From the coast of California to the coast of Indonesia, it covers more ground than every landmass on Earth combined. And sitting inside it, right along the equator, is a band of water that controls the weather for billions of people. Most of the time, that band stays cold on the east side and warm on the west side. That temperature difference is what keeps global weather predictable. Farmers in India count on it. Every person who eats food grown in the tropics counts on it, even if they have never heard the word El Niño. Here is how the balance works. Strong winds blow across the equatorial Pacific from east to west. Those winds push warm surface water toward Asia and Australia, piling it up like water in a tilted bathtub. As that warm water pools in the west, cooler water rises up from the deep ocean on the eastern side, near South America. The whole system hums along like a machine. Warm west, cool east, steady winds, year after year. El Niño is what happens when the machine breaks. Every few years, those trade winds weaken. Nobody fully understands why. When they slow down, the warm water they had been pushing west stops moving. It sits. Then it slides back east, spreading across the central and eastern Pacific like a warm blanket being laid across a cold floor. The ocean's surface temperature rises, sometimes by 2 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes by 4. In the worst events in history, by more than 7 degrees. 7 degrees sounds small. You barely feel 7 degrees walking outside. But the ocean is enormous. When 7 degrees of extra heat spread across millions of square miles of water, it pumps a staggering amount of energy into the atmosphere above it. The air changes, pressure systems shift, jet streams move to different positions than normal. Think of the atmosphere like a river. Under normal conditions, that river flows in a steady channel, carrying rain to the places that need it, and keeping dry air over the places that can handle it. El Niño reroutes the river. Rain falls in the wrong places. The places that depend on that rain get nothing. And that is where the disaster begins. A few degrees of ocean warming does not just change the weather in South America, it changes the weather in India, 8,000 miles away. It dries up the monsoons that feed Asia. It floods the coasts of Peru. It sends drought deep into Africa. Scientists call it a teleconnection, which is just a word for how the ocean talks to the atmosphere, and the atmosphere passes the message to every corner of the world. The most terrifying part is how fast it moves. A super El Niño can form and reach full strength in a matter of months. By the time farmers notice their rains have stopped, the damage is already done. Crops planted in dry soil do not get a second chance. In 1877, the world had no satellites, no ocean buoys, no weather forecasts. Nobody saw it coming. The trade winds weakened, the warm water spread east, and the consequences arrived quietly in the form of cloudless skies where storm clouds should have been. The farmers had no way to know the Pacific Ocean was behind it. They just watched the sky and waited for rain that never came. And what followed was something the world had never seen before. The trade winds are older than human civilization. For tens of thousands of years, sailors used them to cross oceans. They blow west along the equator, steady and reliable, from Africa toward the Americas in the Atlantic, and from South America toward Asia in the Pacific. Ancient sailors called them the trades because they made ocean trade routes possible. They are that consistent. But those winds do more than help ships. They are the engine of the entire global climate system. Here is what they actually do. As they blow across the Pacific, they drag the warm surface water of the ocean with them, pushing it westward. That warm pool builds up near Indonesia and Australia. It grows deep and hot, and because warm water evaporates faster than cold water, that western pool pumps huge amounts of moisture into the atmosphere. That moisture becomes rain. It becomes the monsoons that feed half the planet's population every single year. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, near the coast of South America and Central America, the surface water gets pulled away from the shore by those same winds. Cold water from hundreds of feet below rises up to replace it. That cold upwelling is one of the richest ecosystems on Earth. It feeds enormous fish populations, which in turn feed millions of people along the South American coast. The whole system depends on the winds keeping their strength. When those winds weaken even slightly, the warm water pool in the west starts to drift eastward. The cold upwelling in the east weakens. Ocean temperatures in the Central Pacific rise, and then something happens that most people never consider. The entire weather pattern of the planet shifts because of it. It is similar to tilting a full bathtub. All the water sloshes to one side. When El Niño hits, the warm water sloshes back across the Pacific, and the global weather system tilts with it. Scientists have been tracking trade wind strength since the mid-1800s. In the months leading up to a major El Niño, the pattern is always the same. The winds slow, the temperature gradient across the Pacific flattens, and the signals begin showing up in weather stations thousands of miles away, long before the full disaster arrives. In 1877, there were almost no instruments watching the Pacific. A handful of British colonial weather stations scattered across India, a few barometers on ships, no satellites, no computers, no way to see the Atlantic-sized shift happening in ocean temperatures beneath the surface. One scientist in Bombay, which is now known as Mumbai, noticed the barometric pressure readings had been acting strangely for weeks. Pressure that should have risen was falling. He flagged it in his reports. Nobody acted on it. 3 months later, the monsoon failed. That scientist was a man named Henry Blandford, and he spent the rest of his career trying to build a system that could predict what he had seen coming, but had no tools to stop. His work eventually helped create the field of seasonal weather forecasting. His warning arrived too late for 1877, but it planted a seed that would take a century to grow into real climate science. The winds did not stop all at once. They faded over weeks, almost gently. Nothing about the sky looked alarming. The catastrophe assembled itself quietly, hundreds of miles out at sea, invisible to every person who would eventually suffer from it. Something even harder to understand was happening below the surface. Most people think of the ocean as just a big body of water. It is actually the largest heat storage system on the planet. The Pacific alone holds more energy than the entire atmosphere above it. Here is why that matters. Water takes an enormous amount of energy to warm up. That is why coastal cities stay mild in winter and cool in summer. The ocean absorbs heat slowly, stores it for months, and releases it slowly. It acts like a giant battery, charging up during warm seasons and discharging that heat back into the air over time. Under normal conditions, this system keeps global temperatures stable. The ocean absorbs excess heat from the sun, stores it in its upper layers, and releases it gradually so the atmosphere does not swing wildly between extremes. It is the reason Earth's climate has been relatively stable for thousands of years, and the reason humans were able to build agricultural civilizations in the first place. During El Niño, that battery gets overcharged. The warm water that piles up in the Western Pacific during normal years can sit 20 feet deeper than the water on the eastern side. That is a massive wall of stored heat. When the trade winds weaken and that wall collapses, all that stored energy spreads across the central and eastern Pacific at once. Scientists call this the discharge phase. The ocean essentially dumps months or even years of stored heat into the atmosphere in a matter of weeks. The result is a spike in air temperature above the ocean, and because air carries moisture, warmer air holds more water vapor before releasing it as rain. That means areas already prone to flooding get even more rain, and areas that depend on the ocean releasing moisture through their own regional weather patterns, like the Indian monsoon, get robbed of it. The Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean are connected. When the Pacific discharges its heat eastward during El Niño, it pulls energy away from the atmospheric systems that normally feed the Indian Ocean. The pressure gradients that drive monsoon winds get distorted. The rains that should move inland across India and Southeast Asia every summer slow down, arrive late, or skip entire regions entirely. A shift of just a few degrees in ocean surface temperature can reduce annual rainfall across South Asia by 20 to 30%. For a region where every crop is timed to the monsoon, that is enough to destroy an entire harvest. Now imagine that same discharge happening at a level 7 times stronger than normal. That is what happened in 1877. Scientists studying deep ocean sediment cores, which are basically geological records pulled from the ocean floor, found evidence that the 1877 El Niño was one of the strongest in at least 500 years. The heat discharge was so powerful that it disrupted monsoon systems on 3 separate continents simultaneously. The ocean did not announce this. There was no warning signal anyone could read in 1877. The heat had been building beneath the surface for years, stored in the deep Pacific like a charge in a battery, waiting for the trade winds to weaken enough to release it. When it finally let go, the atmosphere above the Pacific changed within weeks, and the consequences of that change began arriving at coastlines and farms and river valleys, all across the world, right on schedule with the planting season. The timing could not have been worse. Something was about to die in the fields. January 1877 looked normal. Farmers across India, China, and Brazil made their usual plans. They saved seeds, prepared soil, repaired irrigation ditches. The monsoon would come, as it always did. The rains would arrive sometime in June across northern India, earlier in the south. The cycle had worked the same way for as long as anyone could remember. Nobody had a reason to worry. The price of grain was stable. Governments were focused on politics, wars, and trade routes. In India, the British colonial administration was busy managing its territory and sending tax revenues back to London. In China, the Qing dynasty was dealing with internal unrest after decades of conflict. In Brazil, local officials were managing sugar and coffee exports. The weather was the last thing on anyone's mind. But something strange was already underway in the Pacific. Ocean surface temperatures along the equator had been climbing since the previous year. The trade winds had been losing strength slowly through late 1876. By early 1877, a large pool of abnormally warm water had spread across the central Pacific, stretching from the coast of South America nearly to the middle of the ocean. Ships crossing those waters would have noticed the ocean felt warmer than usual, but nobody was measuring it systematically. Nobody had the tools to connect ocean warmth in the middle of the Pacific to rainfall in India 4,000 miles away. The first sign came in April. In the Deccan Plateau of India, a wide, flat agricultural region in the center of the country, farmers planted their crops on schedule. They expected the early monsoon rains to arrive from the south in May. They did not. May came and went. The skies stayed clear and hot. Temperatures climbed to levels that cracked the soil. Seedlings that had pushed up through the earth began to wilt. June arrived. Still no rain. In a normal year, by June the monsoon has swept across the entire southern coast of India and is pushing north. Villages fill with the smell of wet earth. Rivers rise. Fields turn green almost overnight. June 1877 delivered none of that. The sky stayed pale and dry. Temperatures in some areas reached 110 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to blister skin on exposed surfaces and kill livestock standing in open fields. Farmers watched the horizon every morning, looking for the clouds that signal monsoon arrival. The clouds never formed. The air was dry, which is the opposite of what monsoon air feels like. Monsoon air is thick with moisture. June 1877 felt like standing inside an oven. By July, the crop failures in southern India were impossible to ignore. Fields that should have been knee-high with grain were bare brown soil. Local food stores, which normally hold enough grain to cover a bad season, started running low. Prices began climbing. People in cities started noticing that food from the surrounding countryside was getting harder to find and more expensive to buy. The colonial government in India received reports of crop failure, but initially treated them as a regional problem, a local issue, something that would sort itself out. It would not sort itself out. Across the Pacific and around the curve of the Earth, the same cloudless skies were sitting over China, and nobody yet understood that both droughts had the same source. The monsoon is the single most important weather event on Earth for human beings. More people depend on it for food than on any other seasonal weather pattern. It feeds over 2 billion people across South Asia and Southeast Asia every year. When it arrives on time and delivers enough rain, harvests are good and populations are stable. When it fails, people starve. Here is how it works. Every summer, the landmass of Asia heats up faster than the ocean. Hot air over land rises. Cooler, moisture-heavy air from the Indian Ocean rushes inland to replace it. That incoming ocean air carries enormous amounts of water vapor, which gets lifted and cooled as it moves over land, releasing it as rain. That is the monsoon, a seasonal wind pattern driven by the temperature difference between land and sea. It sounds simple, but the system is massive. The Indian summer monsoon drops more water on South Asia in 4 months than the Mississippi River delivers to the Gulf of Mexico in 2 years. It fills rivers, recharges aquifers, irrigates fields, and sustains drinking water for over 1 billion people. Entire agricultural calendars are built around its arrival date, which is predictable down to within a week or two in most years. Rice, wheat, cotton, lentils, sugarcane. All of these crops are planted in anticipation of monsoon rain. Without it, they cannot survive. Irrigation systems in 1877 were basic and local. They could supplement rain in small areas. They could not replace it across an entire subcontinent. The monsoon also has a rhythm. It arrives in the south of India in early June, then marches north over the following 6 to 8 weeks. Different regions get their rain at different times within that window. Farmers time every step of the planting and growing process to that rhythm. They know when to plant, when to fertilize, and when to harvest based on when the rain is expected. When El Niño disrupts the Indian Ocean atmosphere, it breaks that rhythm. The pressure gradient that pulls ocean air inland weakens. The monsoon either arrives late, delivers far less rain than normal, or in extreme cases, barely arrives at all. In a bad monsoon year, rainfall might drop by 20%. Crops suffer, but people manage. Grain reserves cover the shortfall. Food prices rise, but stay manageable. In the 1877 monsoon failure, rainfall dropped by 60 to 70% across large portions of India. Some areas got less than 10% of their normal rain. That is the difference between a hard year and a catastrophe. A useful comparison: imagine a school with a cafeteria that normally feeds 1,000 students every day. A bad day means 200 students go without lunch. A monsoon failure at the scale of 1877 means 900 students go without lunch every day for months. And there is no vending machine, no delivery truck, and no option to go home and eat. By the time the 1877 monsoon season was officially over in October, the damage was already locked in. The crops were dead or stunted, the grain in storage was being consumed faster than anyone planned, and the next planting season was still 6 months away. The scale of the shortfall was becoming clear to anyone paying attention. What nobody had yet understood was that the failure in India was only one piece of something much larger. Henry Blandford sat in his office in Calcutta in the summer of 1877 with a problem he could not explain. He was the head of the Indian Meteorological Department, a position he had taken seriously since his appointment a few years earlier. His job was to track rainfall, temperature, and barometric pressure across the subcontinent and report findings to the colonial government. What his instruments were telling him made no sense. The barometric pressure readings from stations across central and western India had been behaving strangely since April. In a normal monsoon year, pressure drops steadily as the season approaches, pulling ocean air inland. In 1877, the readings were off. Pressure patterns were inconsistent, fluctuating in ways his models could not predict. He flagged the anomaly in internal reports. Nobody responded. By June, the rainfall data confirmed what his pressure readings had hinted. The monsoon was failing. Across the Bombay Presidency, which is now the state of Maharashtra, rainfall totals were running at less than half of normal levels. In the region of Madras, which is now Tamil Nadu, things were worse. Some districts recorded almost no measurable rainfall at all through June and July. Blandford sent urgent dispatches to the government in London. He described the scale of the failure and warned that without intervention, a famine of enormous size was coming. He requested that grain imports be arranged immediately and that food distribution systems be set up across the affected regions. The government delayed. Officials argued over whether the situation was truly as severe as Blandford's reports claimed. Some believed the rains would still come. Others were worried about the cost of importing grain and the political optics of admitting a colonial administration had failed to prevent a food crisis. Meanwhile, the countryside was already breaking down. In villages across Madras and Bombay, local grain merchants began hoarding supplies, anticipating a price surge. Food that was available became unaffordable for common farmers who had already lost their crops and had no income. People began leaving their villages, walking towards cities hoping to find food or work. The roads of southern India filled with thin, exhausted people carrying their remaining possessions. Blandford continued sending reports. He tracked rainfall totals, crop yield estimates, and population movement. His data was meticulous. He was building a picture of the disaster in real time, even as the people with power to act on it sat in meetings arguing. By September, regional administrators could no longer deny what was happening. Famine relief programs were eventually authorized, but they were slow, underfunded, and badly organized. The government set up work camps where starving people could earn food by doing manual labor, but the rations were kept deliberately small, partly due to a political philosophy that believed excessive aid created dependency. People were dying before the relief arrived. Blandford never stopped working. After 1877, he spent years trying to understand the connection between Pacific Ocean conditions and monsoon failure. He published papers on what he called the Great Drought. He came agonizingly close to understanding El Niño, years before anyone gave it that name. The pattern he saw in the data was real, and it was already playing out identically on the other side of the world. By October 1877, the numbers coming out of southern India were unlike anything the colonial administration had recorded. In the Madras region alone, the harvest was down by more than 80% compared to an average year. Fields that should have yielded thousands of tons of rice and millet sat empty. The soil was cracked and pale, baked hard by months without rain. The food system in rural India operated on a simple and fragile logic. Farmers grew enough food to feed their families and sell the surplus. That surplus became the local grain reserve. Merchants stored it and sold it through the year. The reserve was the safety net. In 1877, the surplus never appeared. The harvest was so poor that most farming families consumed everything they grew and still did not have enough. The first people to go hungry were the landless laborers. These were people who owned no land, and survived by working on other farmers' fields in exchange for food or wages. When the harvest failed and farmers had nothing to sell, the wages disappeared. The laborers had no crops of their own, no reserves, and nowhere to turn. Within weeks of the harvest season, these families were starving. Village grain prices doubled, then tripled. A measure of rice that cost a few paise in a normal year became unaffordable for the poorest families. Moneylenders began issuing loans at crushing rates, taking land as collateral. Farmers who had owned their plots for generations signed over everything for a handful of grain, knowing they would likely lose the land and gain nothing. The colonial government response, when it finally arrived in meaningful form, was built around work relief. Starving adults could report to government relief camps and perform physical labor in exchange for a daily food ration. The ration was set at 1 pound of grain per day for an adult doing heavy outdoor labor in intense heat. 1 pound. That is roughly the weight of 2 apples. For someone doing excavation work under the Indian sun, medical workers at the camps began documenting what they saw: limbs that had wasted away to visible bone, children too weak to stand, adults who weighed less than 60 pounds. The visual record of the 1877 famine in India is one of the most disturbing collections of historical photographs in existence, and those images captured only a fraction of what was happening across the countryside. The death toll in India from the 1877 to 1878 famine is estimated at somewhere between 5 and 8 million people. That is just India, and it was just one of several countries experiencing simultaneous collapse. One fact captures the scale: the Madras famine of 1877 killed more people than the entire population of New York City at the time. The grain that could have saved those lives existed somewhere in the world. Ships were crossing the ocean with cargo, but the systems needed to redirect that food, buy it, transport it, and distribute it to the right people did not function fast enough or with enough political will. The death toll was not just the result of drought, it was the result of what happened to a society when the food supply collapsed all at once, with no warning and no backup plan. And the drought was happening again, simultaneously in a country 3,000 miles away. At the exact moment southern India was drying out, the same cloudless sky sat over northern China. The provinces of Shaanxi, Henan, Zhili, and Shandong, a stretch of agricultural land home to hundreds of millions of people, received almost no rain through 1877 and into 1878. These were some of the most densely farmed regions on Earth. The Yellow River Basin, which ran through the heart of this area, had supported Chinese civilization for thousands of years. Communities along it had developed sophisticated irrigation systems, grain storage networks, and farming traditions refined across centuries. But those systems were built to handle difficult years, 2 or 3 in a row if necessary. They were not built for this. The drought in northern China lasted longer than the one in India. Rainfall failed in 1876, worsened through 1877, and continued into 1878. 2 full growing seasons collapsed back to back. Grain prices in affected provinces rose to 10 times their normal level within months. A family that had been comfortable a year earlier could no longer afford to eat. Livestock died because there was no water and no fodder to feed them. Animals that people depended on for farming, for milk, and for meat vanished from the countryside. Once the animals were gone, farmers had no way to plough fields for the next planting season, even if rain eventually came. The Qing government attempted a response. It ordered grain to be shipped from unaffected provinces to the drought regions, but the infrastructure barely existed to move that volume of food. Roads were unpaved and poor. Rivers that normally served as transport routes were dry or dangerously low. Government officials in affected areas reported that by the time relief grain arrived in some districts, the people it was meant to feed were already dead. Foreign missionaries operating in Shanxi province sent letters back to Europe describing what they witnessed. They described villages where the population had dropped by half, fields that had been cultivated for generations sitting empty and silent. Bodies on the roads because the living were too weak to bury them. Children sold by desperate parents in exchange for food. Not as cruelty, but as a last attempt to ensure at least the child survived. The death toll from the North China famine, which historians sometimes call the Incredible Famine, is estimated at between 9 and 13 million people. Some estimates push higher. The province of Shaanxi alone may have lost a third of its entire population. One comparison puts it in scale. The death toll in Shaanxi province alone was roughly equal to the entire population of Los Angeles today. 13 million deaths in China, 5 to 8 million in India, and the drought was still going and still spreading. What made the 1877 event unlike any previous famine was the simultaneity. Every major agricultural civilization in the tropical and subtropical belt was being hit at the same time. Food could not flow from a surplus region because there were no surplus regions. The drought had reached them all, and there was still one more continent being destroyed, thousands of miles to the west. When most people think of famine, they think of Asia or Africa. The 1877 disaster spread deep into South America, hitting Brazil with a drought that was just as extreme, just as sudden, and just as deadly. The northeast region of Brazil, a semi-arid area called the Sertão, sits in the interior of the country far from the coastal rainforests that make Brazil famous. It is a tough land. The communities there had always lived with dry seasons and periodic drought. They had built their lives around it, storing water in cisterns, raising drought-tolerant livestock, and reading the sky for rain the way people in wet climates read clocks. El Niño hits the Sertão in a specific and brutal way. The seasonal rains that normally arrive in this region come from a band of moisture that circles the tropics. When El Niño pushes warm water across the central Pacific, it shifts that moisture band south and away from northeast Brazil. The rains that the Sertão depends on either arrive late, arrive weak, or skip the region entirely. In 1877, they skipped it entirely. The drought that hit northeast Brazil that year became known locally as the Great Drought, or in Portuguese, the Grande Seca. It lasted from 1877 to 1879, 3 consecutive years of almost total rainfall failure in a region that was already operating on a thin margin. Livestock began dying within months. Cattle, goats, and sheep collapsed in fields. Rivers shrank to trickles and then vanished. The São Francisco River, which is one of the longest rivers in Brazil, dropped to historically low levels. Reservoirs that had never run dry in living memory went empty. People began walking. Hundreds of thousands of people left the interior, walking toward the coast, hoping to find food, water, or government help. Many died on the road. The roads themselves were lined with the bodies of animals and people who had not made it. The death toll in northeast Brazil from the Grande Seca is estimated at somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 people. That makes it the deadliest natural disaster in Brazilian recorded history, a record it still holds today. One Brazilian researcher described the scene in the Sertão during the worst months of 1878 as a silence that replaced a civilization. Villages that had housed thousands of people sat empty. The survivors had either left or died. What happened in Brazil in 1877 was happening at the same time in India, in China, and in parts of Africa. The same ocean warming event was the cause in every case. The same weakened trade winds, the same warm Pacific water spreading east, reshaping the entire atmosphere. But the people dying in Brazil had no connection to the people dying in India or China. They could not see each other's suffering. They did not know they shared a cause. All they knew was that the rain had stopped, their animals were dead, and their children were hungry. It would take another century before scientists could look back at all of it and understand that one connected ocean event had reached every corner of the world at once. The picture was becoming clearer, and the scale of the destruction was about to grow even larger. Every farming community in the world carries a buffer. It is the grain kept back after harvest, stored in silos, warehouses, or sealed clay pots held in reserve for the months between growing seasons. In a bad year, the reserve stretches further. In a very bad year, it runs low. In the kind of year that hit India, China, and Brazil in 1877, the reserve was gone before anyone expected. Here is why it disappeared so fast. The 1877 harvest was not 20% below normal. It was 60, 70, even 80% below normal in the worst affected areas. That meant the families who had counted on selling their surplus had almost nothing to sell. The families who had counted on buying grain from local merchants found that the merchants had almost nothing to sell either. The reserves were not built for this scale of failure. A community that normally kept 6 months of grain in storage might have 2 months left after a bad harvest. At 1/3 of normal, they might have 3 or 4 weeks, and they were eating through it every single day. In India, traditional grain storage had been functioning for centuries. Village elders knew how to manage reserves, when to open them, and how to stretch supplies. But the scale of the 1877 failure overwhelmed every local system designed to handle it. The tools were built for a different kind of problem. In China, government grain reserves had been a central part of imperial policy for 1,000 years. The Qing dynasty maintained a network of granaries specifically designed to handle regional crop failures. But by 1877, those granaries had been drawn down by decades of internal war and political instability. The reserve system that should have been full was partially empty before the drought even started. The emptying of reserves created a secondary collapse. Once it became clear that grain was scarce, prices spiked immediately. Merchants who had grain held it back, expecting prices to rise further. Speculators bought large quantities and stored them, betting on even higher prices later. The grain that existed moved away from the people who needed it most and toward the people who could afford to pay more for it. This is how a drought becomes a famine. The drought destroys the harvest. The market concentrates what remains in the hands of the few who can afford it. Everyone else runs out. In Madras, a British colonial official named Richard Temple visited the affected districts in early 1878 and observed grain merchants sitting on full warehouses while people outside them died of hunger. The grain existed. The system for getting it to starving people had broken down completely. His reports described children too weak to walk, adults who had lost 1/3 of their body weight, and villages where the old and sick had simply been left behind when the able-bodied left in search of food elsewhere. The same scene was playing out across 4 countries on 4 different parts of the globe simultaneously. And there was one more layer to the collapse that most people never consider. When the grain ran out and people started moving looking for food in cities and towns, those places quickly became overwhelmed too. Something far darker was following the hunger. Famine does not look the way most people picture it. The images that come to mind, swollen bellies and immediate collapse, represent the very end stages. The actual process of mass starvation is slower and more invisible, and it begins long before anyone dies. The first thing to go is body fat. A person who stops eating burns through fat reserves in a matter of weeks, depending on their size and activity level. For most of the rural poor in 1877, there was very little body fat to begin with. Farmers doing physical labor in tropical heat typically ran lean. Their fat reserves lasted days, sometimes less than 2 weeks. After fat, the body starts breaking down muscle. People get weaker. Tasks that were easy become difficult. Farmers who needed to walk miles to find water or food found themselves unable to make the journey. The physical deterioration happened faster than most observers expected. The second stage is where famine becomes visible to outsiders. People begin to look skeletal. Faces become hollow. Limbs lose mass. Skin hangs loose. Eyes sink. Children, who have less body mass to begin with, reach this stage faster than adults. But famine kills most of its victims before outright starvation. The immune system breaks down as the body prioritizes survival functions. Minor infections become fatal. Wounds that would heal in days fail to close. Diseases that healthy bodies fight off easily become death sentences for starving bodies. In 1877, the most common killers alongside starvation were cholera, typhus, and dysentery. These diseases spread through contaminated water sources, which had become more contaminated as drought concentrated pollutants in shrinking rivers and wells. They spread through crowded relief camps, where starving people gathered in large numbers without sanitation. They spread through villages where the sick and the dying lay in close proximity to the living. Cholera alone killed millions in India during the 1877 famine. It could kill a previously healthy adult in 24 hours. In a person already weakened by months of hunger, death could come in hours. The death rate in the worst affected districts was staggering. In some areas, local colonial records show that between a quarter and a third of the registered population died within 18 months. Rural villages that had been home to thousands of people were reduced to a few hundred survivors. Some smaller settlements simply ceased to exist. British observers who travelled through the affected regions wrote accounts that describe a landscape stripped of normal life. Fields empty, roads empty, markets empty. Village wells surrounded by people too weak to carry water back to their homes. One administrator wrote that riding through a district in southern India in early 1878 felt like riding through a land after a war, except that no army had passed through. The destruction was total, and it came from inside the population itself. Children were dying faster than adults because their bodies had less reserve and less ability to fight disease. Medical missionaries documented infant mortality rates that wiped out entire age groups in some communities. Children born between 1875 and 1878 are statistically almost invisible in later census records. For some Indian districts, they simply did not survive. The deaths were accelerating, and they were being made worse by decisions being made far away in offices and meeting rooms. The famine of 1877 did not happen in a vacuum. It happened inside colonial systems, and the decisions those colonial governments made in response to the crisis shaped the death toll as much as the drought itself. India in 1877 was governed by the British Empire. The highest authority was the Viceroy, a man named Lord Lytton. He had been appointed the previous year and arrived in India with strong views about economics and governance. Among those views was a belief that government aid to the poor created dependency, undermined local economies, and set bad precedents. When the famine reports arrived on his desk, his first response was to restrict the scale and cost of the relief effort. He ordered that no region should qualify for full government food aid unless it could prove a total crop failure. Partial failures, even devastating ones, would not trigger the full relief mechanism. He also set strict standards for the relief work camps, limiting the daily food ration to a level that a British administrator named William Digby later described as below what the Nazi concentration camp system would later provide during World War II. The daily caloric allowance in some British-run famine relief camps in India in 1877 was lower than the rations given to prisoners in Buchenwald. At the same time, grain exports from India to Britain continued through the famine. India was exporting millions of pounds of wheat to the British market, while its own population starved. The export trade was too profitable and too politically important to pause. Ships loaded with Indian grain left Indian ports, while people 10 miles from those ports were dying. This decision is one of the most debated aspects of the 1877 famine among historians. Some argue that the volume of exports was not large enough to have meaningfully changed the outcome if redirected to famine relief. Others argue that it was a moral catastrophe regardless of the numbers, and that the political will to halt the exports would have signalled a different relationship between the colonial government and the people it governed. In China, the Qing government's response was constrained by different problems. The dynasty had been financially devastated by decades of internal rebellion. The infrastructure to move food from surplus provinces to deficit ones barely functioned. Officials in disaster-struck areas sent frantic reports to Beijing, the responses came back slowly and with insufficient resources. Foreign missionaries filled part of the gap. Christian organizations from Europe and America raised funds and organized grain distribution in parts of northern China. Their accounts provide some of the most detailed records of what actually happened on the ground during the worst months of the famine. Brazil's imperial government essentially failed to respond at all in any organized way. The Northeast was remote, politically marginalized, and ethnically different from the coastal population centers where power was concentrated. The people dying in the Sertão were largely poor mixed-race and indigenous communities whose suffering carried little political weight in the imperial capital. The political decisions made by each of these governments did not cause the drought, but they determined how many of the people caught in the drought survived. The drought could have been managed, not perfectly, but the death toll was shaped as much by politics as by rainfall, and the full weight of those decisions was about to land on the most vulnerable people in the population. Food gets the attention. It is the visible crisis, but water was the first thing to disappear, and its disappearance set off a chain of destruction that reached far beyond the harvest. In a normal monsoon year, the rains replenish everything. Rivers run full. Groundwater levels rise. Wells that had dropped through the dry season fill back up. Ponds and tanks, which are the small reservoirs that communities built across South Asia and China over centuries, refill from overflow. The whole water system resets every year, and communities build their lives around that reset. When the rains do not come, the reset does not happen. Rivers that depend on monsoon runoff begin to shrink in September, when the rains normally end. In a drought year, they never got full to begin with, so they are already low by the time the dry season starts. Through October, November, and December, they keep dropping. By January and February, rivers that are normally 20 feet deep are shallow enough to wade across in places. Some tributaries stop flowing entirely. Wells are the backup system. When rivers run low, communities rely more heavily on wells, but wells draw from underground aquifers which are recharged by rainwater soaking through the soil. Without monsoon rain, the aquifer recharge does not happen. Wells that people had always treated as reliable started running dry by mid-1877 in the worst affected areas. Some were dry by October, before the normal dry season had even fully set in. In northern China, the Yellow River Basin had a more complex water system, but the same principle applied. Centuries of irrigation engineering had created an intricate network of canals, diversions. That network depended on snowmelt from mountains and seasonal rainfall to stay functional. The 1877 drought starved the entire network. Canals ran empty. Irrigation channels became dry trenches. Fields that had been watered by the river system for generations lost their water supply and turned to dust. The loss of water did something beyond killing crops. It concentrated people around the remaining sources. Whatever water still flowed drew the survivors of the surrounding countryside toward it. Wells that still produced water became gathering points for hundreds or thousands of people from dozens of villages. That concentration created its own catastrophe. Contamination spread fast. People desperate for water used whatever was available, regardless of condition. Stagnant pools, the last remnants of dried-up ponds, became shared drinking sources for both humans and animals. The diseases that spread through those water sources killed people who might have otherwise survived the food shortage. In the relief camps the British set up in India, water sanitation was minimal. Thousands of people shared limited water sources. Cholera moved through those camps like fire through dry grass. Camp administrators recorded deaths by the hundreds per week in the largest facilities. By the time rain finally returned to most affected regions in late 1878, the landscape had been fundamentally altered. Springs that had flowed for generations had gone dry. Underground water tables had dropped to new lows. Communities that returned to their villages after the famine found that the water systems they depended on had not recovered along with the rain. Some villages never recovered at all. The drought had not just taken food and water, it had taken the infrastructure of survival itself. Starvation and disease have always traveled together. But the 1877 famine demonstrated just how catastrophically that combination scales when it spreads across a continent. The immune system is one of the most energy-hungry systems in the human body. It burns through nutrients at a high rate, just keeping a person healthy under normal conditions. When the body goes into starvation mode, it starts making choices about where to send limited resources. Survival functions come first. The immune system gets deprioritized. A person who has been under-eating for 2 months is not the same as a person who skipped lunch. Their body temperature regulation is impaired. Their skin barrier is weakened. Their gut lining is damaged by lack of nutrition, making it easier for bacteria and parasites to enter the bloodstream. Their white blood cell counts drop. Infections that a healthy person would fight off in a week become life-threatening in a matter of days. In 1877, this immune collapse was happening to millions of people simultaneously across densely populated regions. The disease that killed the most people during the famine was cholera. It spreads through water contaminated with the cholera bacteria. It causes severe dehydration through rapid fluid loss. A healthy adult can survive cholera with adequate hydration and rest. A starving adult with no access to clean water and no food to support recovery dies within hours. Cholera moved through the water systems of southern India with terrifying speed. Contaminated rivers carried it downstream from infected areas. Relief camps became amplifiers. Thousands of weak, malnourished people crowded together, sharing water sources and sanitation facilities, created ideal conditions for cholera to spread faster than it ever would in a healthy population. British medical records from the 1877 famine in India estimate that cholera alone killed somewhere between 4 and 6 million people during the crisis period. That is a number comparable to the entire death toll of some wars. Typhus followed a similar path. It spreads through body lice, which became common in crowded relief camps where personal hygiene was impossible to maintain. Typhus causes high fever, mental confusion, and organ failure in its severe form. The death rate from typhus in malnourished populations can reach 50%. Dysentery, spread by fecal contamination of food and water, hit children especially hard. Children's immune systems and fluid reserves are both smaller than adults. Dysentery dehydrates its victims. Combined with starvation, it killed children within days of infection. In northern China, malaria spread through areas that had been flooded briefly by inconsistent rains. Before drought conditions returned, the temporary pools left behind by those isolated storms became breeding grounds for mosquitoes. Malaria, combined with extreme malnourishment, killed people who had previously survived repeated exposure to the disease. The disease toll cannot be fully separated from the starvation toll in historical records. Medical officials of the era did not always distinguish between a person who died of cholera and a person who died of starvation-induced immune collapse that allowed cholera to kill them. The recorded cause of death was the disease. The underlying cause was hunger. The combined death toll from starvation and famine-related disease was enormous, and calculating the true number turned out to be one of the hardest problems historians and scientists would face a century later. How do you count the dead when nobody counted them while they were alive? This is the central challenge in understanding the 1877 famine. The regions hit hardest: rural India, rural northern China. The Brazilian interior did not have reliable census systems. Colonial records tracked taxes, trade, and military movements. They tracked population in aggregate, not in detail. When millions of people died in remote villages over an 18-month period, the documentation was scattered, inconsistent, and politically shaped. British colonial officials in India had strong reasons to undercount deaths. A large death toll was an embarrassment. It suggested the government had failed. It opened the administration to criticism from Parliament and from an increasingly vocal press in Britain itself. Some officials filed reports that described the famine as substantially managed, while their own subordinates were writing private letters describing catastrophic death rates. In China, the Qing government records are fragmentary. The provinces most affected, Shaanxi, and Henan, had already experienced significant population disruption in previous decades due to rebellion and warfare. Baseline population numbers were uncertain. Comparing pre-famine and post-famine population counts required estimates built on other estimates. The death toll calculation became clearer decades later, when historians and climate scientists began cross-referencing multiple sources. They compared colonial census data from before and after the famine. They analyzed missionary reports from China and India, which often included detailed local counts because missionaries tracked their congregations by name. They reviewed grain price records, which spike sharply during famine and flatline afterward, in ways that track the severity and duration of the crisis. They also used indirect methods. Regional tax rolls showed dramatic drops in the number of taxable households after 1878. In some Indian districts, the number of registered households dropped by more than 30% between 1876 and 1882. Some of that decline represents people who moved away. The rest represents people who died. When all these sources were combined, historians arrived at a range. The death toll from the 1877 to 1878 El Niño-driven global famine is estimated at between 50 and 60 million people. Some researchers push the number slightly lower. Others argue it could be higher. The uncertainty is built into the evidence. 50 million is the number most commonly cited, and it is worth sitting with that figure for a moment. At the time of the famine, the total global population was somewhere around 1.5 billion people. 50 million deaths represented roughly 3% of every human being alive on Earth. 3% across 2 years, driven by one weather pattern. For comparison, World War I, which lasted 4 years and involved the most destructive military conflict the world had ever seen up to that point, killed somewhere between 15 and 19 million people through direct combat and related causes. The 1877 famine killed 2 to 3 times as many people in half the time, with no weapons. The death toll was real. The methodology behind estimating it was painstaking and careful. The number is almost certainly an undercount, and the full weight of what that number means for the world today is a question that scientists are still working to answer. The scale alone should stop anyone cold, but there is one more dimension to the death toll that makes it even harder to process. The number 50 million needs a frame to make sense. 50 million is abstract. It does not feel real until you put it next to something that does. The deadliest single-day battle in American military history was the first day of the Battle of the Somme in World War I, on July 1st, 1916. The British Army lost around 57,000 men in one day. The 1877 famine killed more people than that every 2 to 3 days for 18 months straight. The 1918 influenza pandemic, sometimes called the Spanish flu, is often listed as one of the deadliest events in modern human history. It killed somewhere between 20 and 50 million people worldwide over about 2 years. The 1877 famine killed at least as many, and likely more, and did so without anyone in the affected regions fully understanding that they were experiencing a global event rather than a local one. World War II is the largest conflict in recorded history. Total deaths, combining combat casualties, civilian deaths, and deaths in concentration camps, are estimated at somewhere between 70 and 85 million people. The 1877 famine, driven by weather, achieved roughly 60 to 70% of that death toll. These comparisons are not made to diminish any of those other events. Each one was a catastrophe of its own kind. They are made to show that the 1877 famine belongs in the same historical tier as the most destructive events that human civilization has ever recorded. The difference is that the 1877 famine is almost completely unknown outside of specialist academic circles. Part of that invisibility comes from geography. The people who died were mostly in India, China, and Brazil, in rural and colonized populations that had little political voice and little ability to record their own stories in ways that would be preserved and distributed widely. The colonial powers who governed parts of these regions had no interest in documenting their own policy failures. The communities that survived were too depleted to build lasting monuments to what had happened. Part of the invisibility comes from the nature of the disaster itself. Famine is slow. It does not produce a single dramatic moment that can be captured in one image or tied to one date. It spreads and deepens over months. By the time it becomes undeniable, the worst of it is already over, and the survivors are focused on rebuilding. Historians who work on the 1877 famine describe it as the event that climate change researchers should study most carefully. It shows what happens when a global weather system destabilizes at the same time across multiple continents, hitting populations that have no warning, no surplus, and no political protection. The death toll was enormous. The causes were clear in retrospect. The warning signs existed, but were misread. The political responses made everything worse. Every one of those elements is present in the conversation about the El Niño forming right now. And there is one number that sits underneath all of this that is even harder to process than the death toll itself. In 1877, there were roughly 1.5 billion people alive on Earth. That is less than 1/5 of the current global population. The planet was less connected, less technologically advanced, and in many regions still operating on agricultural systems that had barely changed in centuries. 50 million deaths in that context is a different kind of number than 50 million deaths today. In 2025, the global population is around 8 billion people. 50 million deaths would represent less than 1% of humanity. It would be staggering. It would be one of the worst disasters in modern history. But it would be less than 1%. In 1877, it was 3%. 3% of all humans alive, gone in 2 years. For scale, 3% of the current global population would be 240 million people. That is roughly the entire population of Brazil today, wiped out in 24 months. 3% sounds like a statistic, but it was not distributed evenly. The deaths were concentrated in specific regions, which means that in the hardest hit areas, the percentage was not 3%. It was 30, 40, or 50%. Some districts in India and China lost half their population. Half. 1 out of every 2 people in a given village, a given valley, a given county, dead within 2 years. Communities do not recover quickly from that. When half the working-age adults in a farming community die in 2 years, the knowledge those adults carried dies with them. Irrigation techniques passed down through generations, seed selection knowledge, local weather patterns and what they meant for planting decisions. Oral histories, trade relationships, all of it tied to specific people, all of it gone when those people died. The agricultural recovery in some parts of India and China took a decade, not because the land was permanently damaged, though in some cases it was, but because the human knowledge needed to farm it efficiently had been lost. The people who knew how to manage the local water systems, which fields flooded easily, which needed extra irrigation, were dead. A generation of children who never learned those things from their parents had to figure them out from scratch. Census data from India shows that in some severely affected districts, the population did not return to pre-famine levels until the early 20th century. 20 to 30 years of recovery time for communities that had been stable for centuries. The ripple effects of 3% deaths are not 3% effects. They cascade, they compound, they reshape communities, economies, and knowledge systems in ways that continue for generations. The scientists studying El Niño today use the 1877 event as a baseline. They call it the worst-case historical reference point. The question they are trying to answer is whether the El Niño forming now has the potential to hit anywhere near that baseline. The ocean temperatures in the Pacific are already moving in a direction that concerns them. What those scientists are seeing on their monitors right now leads somewhere the 1877 world had no tools to look. The rains came back in late 1878, slowly at first, then with more force as the monsoon system rebuilt itself. The Pacific Ocean had released its stored heat. The trade winds strengthened again. The atmospheric patterns that had been locked in drought position for nearly 2 years began shifting back toward normal. The crops did not come back as fast as the rain. Farmers who returned to their fields after the famine found soil that had been baked and cracked for so long it had changed in texture. The top layer, which normally holds the organic material that makes farmland productive, had been blown away by months of dry wind. What remained was harder, less absorbent, and slower to respond to water. Seeds planted in it took longer to germinate. Early crops were weaker than usual. Farmers also lacked the tools and animals they needed to work the land. Livestock had been eaten or had died during the famine. Draft animals, the bullocks that pulled plows across South Asian and Chinese farms, were gone. Without animals, fields could not be prepared at the scale needed. Without prepared fields, crop yields stayed low even with adequate rain. The human workforce was depleted in ways that took years to feel fully. Farm labor in 1877 was physical and communal. Planting rice, harvesting grain, managing irrigation channels, all of it required large numbers of coordinated people working together. Villages that had lost a third or half of their population could not coordinate that labor the same way. Tasks that 10 families could do together now fell to 5 or 3. Debt was the other anchor holding communities down. During the famine, families had borrowed grain, money, and resources at crushing interest rates from moneylenders and local merchants. Those debts did not disappear when the rain returned. Farmers who had mortgaged their land to survive now owed money they could not repay on depleted harvests. Many lost their land permanently. In southern India, British administrators documented a wave of land concentration that followed the famine. Small farmers who had owned their plots for generations sold or lost them to larger landowners and merchants who had survived the famine with capital intact. The agricultural class in many districts emerged from the recovery smaller, poorer, and more dependent on landlords than it had been before 1877. In northern China, the recovery was similarly slow. The Shaanxi province, which had lost a third of its population, saw its agricultural output stay below normal for over a decade. Some irrigation infrastructure that had taken generations to build was never fully repaired. Rivers whose banks had been carefully managed by farming communities for centuries had shifted during the drought, making old channel routes useless. The one region that showed a faster recovery was Brazil, partly because some coastal areas had received enough rain during the crisis to maintain food production, and the government eventually organized migration programs to bring workers from the drought-affected northeast to other parts of the country. But northeast Brazil itself remained vulnerable. The same drought pattern would return in 1888, and again in 1919, and again in 1932. The Sertão had entered a cycle that its communities would spend the next century struggling to break. The famine of 1877 did not end cleanly. It faded over years, leaving a changed landscape, changed communities, and changed understanding of what weather could do. And then, just over a century later, the ocean did it again. For most of the 20th century, El Niño was considered a regional weather event, something that affected fishermen along the South American coast, something that changed rainfall patterns in Peru and Ecuador. Scientists knew it existed. They had named it. But the full global reach of the phenomenon and the extremes it could reach were not widely understood until 1982. That year, something unusual started happening in the Pacific. Ocean temperatures along the equator began rising in mid-1982. At first, the readings seemed within normal range. Seasonal fluctuations happen every year. The instruments showed warming, but warming happens. Nobody raised an immediate alarm. By September, the warming had accelerated past anything scientists had recorded in the modern monitoring era. The eastern equatorial Pacific, the stretch of ocean between South America and the Central Pacific, saw surface temperatures rise by more than 7 degrees Fahrenheit above their normal level. That is an enormous jump. It happened faster than the monitoring systems were designed to expect. The atmosphere responded immediately. The jet stream over North America shifted south and locked into an unusual position. California, which normally gets most of its rainfall in winter, received storm after storm. Flooding destroyed neighborhoods up and down the coast. Mudslides buried homes. Infrastructure built to handle typical California winters failed completely. At the same time, Australia baked. The continent, which depends on Pacific moisture patterns for its rainfall, saw one of the worst droughts in its recorded history. Bushfires burned across enormous stretches of the southeast. Crop failures hit multiple agricultural regions simultaneously. Ecuador and Peru experienced floods so severe that entire coastal regions were reshaped. Rivers jumped their banks permanently. Towns were buried under mud. The fishing industry, which had been the economic foundation of Peru's Pacific coast for generations, collapsed almost overnight because the warm water had pushed the cold, fish-rich water offshore and out of range. Southern Africa went dry. Indonesia went dry. India received irregular monsoons. The global weather system behaved as if someone had reached into it and rearranged the basic wiring. Scientists were watching this in real time, with better tools than anyone had in 1877, but still nowhere near the monitoring capability that exists today. The scale of what was happening exceeded every model they had built. Their forecasts had missed the intensity entirely. The final damage assessment from the 1982 to 1983 El Niño ran to tens of billions of dollars. 1/4 of the entire globe experienced severe weather disruption during its peak. It lasted nearly 2 years before ocean temperatures began returning to normal. And for the first time, climate scientists began asking a serious question. If a modern El Niño with modern agriculture and modern infrastructure could cause that level of disruption, what had an even stronger event done to a world without any of those buffers? The answer was 1877. The question they started asking next was darker. What would happen if an event stronger than 1982 arrived in the modern world? In 1997, they got a partial answer. 15 years after 1982, the Pacific warmed again. Scientists saw it coming this time. Monitoring buoys placed across the equatorial Pacific in the years following the 1982 event gave researchers real data from the ocean itself, not just air readings and satellite estimates. By early 1997, the buoys were showing a clear warming trend. The forecast was issued months before the event peaked. The 1997 El Niño became one of the strongest on record. Ocean temperatures in the central and eastern Pacific rose by nearly as much as the 1982 event at their peak. But this time, scientists were tracking it in detail, hour by hour, region by region. They could see which areas would be hit by drought, which by flooding, and roughly when the disruption would arrive. The forecasts saved lives. Countries in the path of predicted flooding had time to reinforce infrastructure and move people out of vulnerable areas. Farmers in some regions shifted to different crops that could handle drier conditions. Governments stockpiled food supplies in areas where shortage was predicted. Even with all of that preparation, the damage was enormous. Southern Africa experienced a drought that put 5 million people in immediate risk of famine. Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique all declared states of emergency. Crop failures wiped out staple food supplies across the region. International food aid organizations rushed supplies to the most affected areas and prevented mass starvation, but only through enormous effort and significant cost. Indonesia burned. The drought conditions created by the 1997 El Niño turned the island's forests into fuel. Fires that began as agricultural clearing burns ran out of control across enormous areas. The smoke blanketed Southeast Asia for months. Air quality in cities across Malaysia, Singapore, and the Philippines dropped to dangerous levels. The fires destroyed an area roughly the size of Maryland. Australia experienced severe drought across its agricultural heartland. Grain harvests dropped sharply. Livestock died in large numbers. The economic impact ran into billions of dollars. In Peru, the opposite problem arrived. Torrential rains flooded coastal regions and destroyed infrastructure that had not been rebuilt to withstand a repeat of 1982. The flooding killed hundreds of people and displaced hundreds of thousands more. What the 1997 event demonstrated was both encouraging and sobering. Encouraging because the early warning system worked. Governments received months of advance notice and used it. International food systems moved supplies toward areas of predicted need. The death toll was a fraction of what an equal-strength event would have caused in 1877. Sobering because even with all of that, 5 million people in southern Africa came within reach of famine. Even with modern supply chains, global food reserves, and satellite weather forecasting, one strong El Niño nearly pushed several countries to the edge. The gap between 1877 and 1997 showed how much had improved. The 1997 event showed how much remained fragile, and the scientists watching the Pacific in 2026 were seeing ocean temperatures moving toward levels that exceed both. Between 1877 and 1997, something remarkable happened in climate science. Scientists went from having almost no understanding of why global weather patterns shifted to being able to predict El Niño events months in advance with reasonable accuracy. That transformation did not happen all at once. It happened through a series of observations, failures, and breakthroughs spread across 100 years. The first major insight came from a British scientist named Gilbert Walker in the early 20th century. Walker was stationed in India, tasked with figuring out why the monsoons sometimes failed. He had access to weather records from stations around the world, and he spent years looking for patterns in the data. He found 1. The atmospheric pressure in the eastern Pacific and the atmospheric pressure in the western Pacific moved in opposite directions. When pressure was high in the east, it was low in the west. When pressure dropped in the east, it rose in the west. He called this pattern the Southern Oscillation. He published his findings in the 1920s. At the time, most scientists considered it an interesting curiosity. Decades later, a Norwegian scientist named Jakob Bjerknes made the connection that Walker had missed. Bjerknes was studying sea surface temperatures in the Pacific and realized that Walker's pressure pattern and the ocean temperature changes during El Niño were the same phenomenon seen from two different angles. The ocean and the atmosphere were feeding back into each other. Warm ocean water changed the atmosphere above it. The changed atmosphere altered the winds. The altered winds changed the ocean. The whole system reinforced itself in a loop. This insight, developed in the late 1960s, gave scientists the first working model of how El Niño actually functioned as a system. It explained why El Niño events were self-amplifying once they started, and why they took months to build and months to decay. The monitoring network came next. After the 1982 event caught scientists completely off guard, agencies in the United States and internationally rushed to build a real-time ocean observation system. Buoys were deployed across the equatorial Pacific, measuring ocean temperature, salinity, and current speed at multiple depths. Satellites began tracking sea surface temperatures from orbit. The data started flowing in. By the mid-1990s, scientists had enough data and computing power to build forecasting models that could detect the early signs of an El Niño forming and project its likely path months ahead. The 1997 event was the first major test of those models. They performed well enough to provide meaningful warning. Each El Niño event since then has added to the database. Scientists now have decades of detailed observations to work with, and the models have grown more accurate with each cycle. The one thing the models still cannot predict with certainty is the peak intensity of a given event. The ocean is complex. The atmosphere is complex still. A developing El Niño can strengthen faster than expected, or stall and weaken before it fully develops. What the models are showing in 2026 is a warming trend that has not stalled. The tools scientists used to watch a super El Niño forming did not exist 40 years ago. Today, they produce a continuous, real-time picture of the Pacific Ocean's surface temperature that would have seemed like magic to the researchers who scrambled to understand the 1982 event. The backbone of the system is a network of ocean buoys. There are roughly 70 of them spread across the equatorial Pacific, in a grid pattern, each one anchored to the ocean floor by a cable hundreds of feet long. Each buoy carries sensors that measure water temperature at multiple depths, from just below the surface down to around 1,000 feet. They transmit data to satellites every few hours. The buoy network is called the Tropical Atmosphere Ocean Array. Scientists study its readings the way a doctor studies a patient's vital signs. The key measurement is not just what the surface temperature is today, but how it compares to the average for that date over the past several decades. A temperature reading 1 degree above average is worth noting. 2 degrees above average means significant warming. 3 or more degrees above average means something major is happening. Satellites add a second layer. Specialized instruments aboard weather satellites measure the temperature of the ocean's surface from orbit. They cover the entire Pacific every few days, producing images that look like heat maps. The warm water shows up in reds and oranges. The cool water appears in blues and greens. Watching those maps over weeks and months, scientists can see a warm pool forming, spreading, and strengthening in near real time. The third tool is the network of underwater sensors that measure what scientists call the warm water volume. The Western Pacific normally piles up an enormous amount of warm water near the surface, building what is sometimes called the warm water reservoir. When El Niño begins, that reservoir sloshes eastward. Scientists track how much warm water is sitting above the thermocline, which is the boundary between warm surface water and cold deep water, across the whole equatorial Pacific. A rising warm water volume across the central and eastern Pacific is one of the clearest early warning signs that an El Niño is building. When all three data sources are combined and fed into computer models, scientists can produce a forecast that extends several months into the future. The models run thousands of simulations, each with slightly different starting conditions, and the range of outcomes they produce gives scientists a sense of how confident they can be in their forecast. The most critical number they watch is called the Niño 3.4 index. It measures the average surface temperature of a specific rectangle of the Central Pacific, roughly spanning from the coast of South America outward toward the dateline. When that index rises half a degree above normal for 3 consecutive months, an El Niño is officially declared. The higher and faster it rises, the stronger the event is expected to be. In early 2026, the Niño 3.4 index began rising faster than it had in the previous 20 years. The satellite maps showed an expanding pool of warm water across the Central Pacific that was deepening and strengthening week by week. The buoy readings confirmed it from below. The data was unambiguous. Something significant was forming, and the projections for where it could go were deeply unsettling. In May 2026, climate agencies released updated El Niño forecasts that stopped a lot of researchers cold. The models were projecting ocean surface temperatures in the Central Pacific rising by as much as 5.4 degrees Fahrenheit above normal at peak intensity. That number sits in territory that only one event in the modern monitoring era has exceeded, the 1982 to 1983 El Niño, which peaked at around 7 degrees above normal. 5.4 degrees is a threshold that carries historical weight. The 1877 El Niño, estimated from geological and historical records, likely produced ocean temperature anomalies in the same range. Scientists cannot measure the 1877 event directly, but by working backward from monsoon failure records, crop yield data, and ocean sediment cores that preserve temperature signatures from centuries ago, they can estimate where the Pacific was. The 2026 forecast sits inside the same bracket. What that means, in practical terms, is significant. A 5-degree plus ocean temperature anomaly in the equatorial Pacific pushes the atmospheric disruption into a different category than a typical El Niño. The jet stream shifts are larger, the pressure gradient changes across the tropics are stronger, the suppression of monsoon systems is more severe, the rainfall disruptions in vulnerable regions are more extreme. Forecasting models project that the 2026 event, if it reaches its projected peak, would affect agriculture across South Asia, Southeast Asia, Eastern Africa, and Northeast Brazil simultaneously. These are the same regions that failed in 1877. The drought footprint overlaps almost perfectly. The difference between 2026 and 1877 is enormous in some ways. Early warning systems gave farmers and governments months of lead time. Modern agricultural technology, drought-resistant crop varieties, precision irrigation, and satellite-guided planting decisions provide tools that did not exist 150 years ago. Global food trade allows surpluses from one region to reach deficit regions faster than ever before in history. But those advantages have limits. They work when one or two regions experience shortage, while others maintain normal output. They strain when 3 or 4 major agricultural regions experience simultaneous failure. They break when supply chains face stress from multiple directions at once. The 2026 forecast showed exactly that multi-region stress pattern forming. Scientists were careful with their language in public statements. They described the developing event as serious, potentially historic, and warranting urgent preparation. They stopped short of predicting a catastrophe because the models carry uncertainty and the modern world's resilience is genuinely stronger than 1877's. But inside research discussions, a different kind of conversation was happening. Researchers who had spent careers studying El Niño were quietly noting that the conditions forming in the Pacific in 2026 looked more like the lead up to 1877 than any event they had seen in the modern era. The ocean was warming, the forecasts were clear, and the specific question that mattered most was whether the world built around those advantages was as strong as it believed. Modern farming is extraordinary. A wheat farmer in Kansas today uses satellite imagery to monitor soil moisture across individual sections of a field. They apply fertilizer precisely, guided by soil sensors. They plant seed varieties bred to resist drought, disease, and heat stress. They have access to futures markets that let them lock in prices months before harvest. They can call a university extension service and get expert advice within hours. Compare that to a farmer in Madras in 1877, working with hand tools, saved seeds, and no forecast beyond looking at the sky. The gap is enormous. Modern agriculture has allowed the global food supply to grow far faster than population, feeding 8 billion people on roughly the same amount of cropland that fed 2 billion a century ago. That is a genuine achievement. The fragility is built into the same system that created the strength. Modern agriculture runs on tight margins. Farmers borrow money each spring to buy seed, fertilizer, and fuel, then pay it back after harvest. If the harvest fails, the debt remains. The financial model requires a successful harvest almost every year. A single catastrophic season can bankrupt a farming operation that has run profitably for decades. Modern agriculture also depends on global supply chains. Fertilizer produced in Russia and Belarus supplies farms in Brazil. Fuel for farm equipment flows from the Middle East. Pesticides come from chemical plants in Asia. Seeds are produced by a small number of large corporations and distributed globally. Every link in that chain is optimized for normal conditions. When conditions stop being normal, the optimization becomes a weakness. A super El Niño in 2026 that suppresses rainfall across South Asia reduces the rice and wheat harvest in India and Pakistan. Those two countries together produce enough grain to feed over 2 billion people. A simultaneous drought in Brazil hit soybean production, which is a critical ingredient in animal feed for chicken, pork, and beef production globally. A drought in East Africa reduces the output of a region that feeds over 1 billion people with minimal buffer. When all three happen at the same time, the global food trade cannot fully compensate. There is not enough surplus elsewhere to replace the combined deficit. Prices rise sharply. Lower-income countries that depend on food imports cannot afford the higher prices. The food insecurity that follows is not starvation on the scale of 1877, but it is serious. The modern food system has one more fragility that 1877 did not have: concentration. 150 years ago, thousands of seed varieties were grown across millions of farms. Today, a handful of crop varieties dominate global production. Those varieties are highly productive under the conditions they were bred for. Under conditions significantly outside that range, their performance drops sharply. Climate scientists call this genetic vulnerability. The very crops that feed the modern world are less adapted to climate extremes than the diverse, locally adapted varieties they replaced. The modern system is stronger than 1877 in almost every way that counts under normal stress. Under stress that exceeds its design range, the vulnerabilities become visible in ways that are hard to predict in advance. The question for 2026 is whether the event forming in the Pacific will stay within that range or push past it. The global food supply chain is one of the most complex systems humans have ever built. On any given day, grain ships are crossing every major ocean. Refrigerated containers carrying fruit, meat, and vegetables are moving through ports on 6 continents. Commodity markets in Chicago, London, and Singapore are pricing food weeks and months in advance. The system is so large, so interconnected, and so fast that a drought in Argentina registers in grocery prices in Egypt within months. Under normal conditions, this system is remarkable at moving food toward need. When one region has a bad harvest, other regions export more. Prices signal where food is needed, and food moves toward high-price areas. The system is not perfectly fair or perfectly efficient, but it generally prevents localized shortages from becoming famines in countries that have money to buy food internationally. The weakness emerges when multiple major producing regions fail simultaneously. The global food system has major concentration points. 4 countries, the United States, Brazil, Argentina, and Australia, produce the majority of the world's exported grain and soybeans. Russia and Ukraine together were responsible for a significant share of global wheat exports, until geopolitical disruption altered that picture. India dominates global rice exports. A disruption to any one of these producers tightens the global market. A disruption to several at once creates a genuine crisis. El Niño does not hit all of these producers equally, and it does not hit them all at the same time. But a strong event can hit multiple major producers within the same 12-month window. Australia, India, and Brazil all face serious drought risk during a major El Niño. South Africa and parts of East Africa face the same. In 1997, the El Niño-related drought in Australia reduced grain production significantly. Brazil had a rough year. South Africa declared an emergency. Each of those events raised prices individually. Together, they caused global food commodity prices to spike sharply in 1997 and 1998. The spike was manageable because the United States had a good year and could export more. The buffer held. The 2026 events forecast suggests drought stress hitting Australia, India, and Brazil in overlapping windows. United States corn and wheat production could also face disruption depending on how the jet stream shift plays out. If the primary backup producer is also under stress, the buffer that held in 1997 may not hold in 2026. Countries that import most of their food, including large parts of the Middle East, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa, are the most exposed. They buy food on international markets. When prices spike by 50 or 70%, which happened during the 2008 food crisis. Lower-income households in those countries spend a catastrophic share of their income on basic food. In some countries, over half of household income goes to food in normal years. A major price spike pushes those households past the edge. The 1877 event killed people through crop failure and political neglect. A 2026 event at similar intensity would kill people differently, through price spikes, supply disruptions, and the cascading effects of food insecurity in import-dependent countries. The mechanism changes. The outcome, for the most vulnerable populations, shares the same logic. El Niño does not hurt everywhere equally. It has a geographic signature, a pattern of drought and flood, that repeats with enough consistency that scientists can map the risk zones in advance. The regions most at risk in 2026 are not random. They are the same regions that suffered most in 1877 and 1997. The pattern holds. South Asia is at the top of the risk list. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka all depend heavily on the Indian Ocean monsoon for their annual rainfall. A strong El Niño suppresses that monsoon, reducing rainfall across the entire subcontinent. India alone grows enough food for 1.5 billion people. Even a 20% reduction in harvest output creates a serious problem. A 30% reduction creates a crisis that international food markets struggle to cover. Southeast Asia faces similar risk. Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, the Philippines, and Indonesia all depend on seasonal rainfall tied to the same atmospheric systems that El Niño disrupts. Rice production in Southeast Asia represents the food security of hundreds of millions of people. A drought that cuts regional rice output by a significant margin sends prices soaring across Asia and reaches poor households on every continent that depends on cheap rice imports. Eastern and Southern Africa carry extreme vulnerability. Countries like Kenya, Ethiopia, Somalia, Tanzania, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe have minimal agricultural buffers. Farming in these regions is largely rain-fed, with minimal irrigation. When rainfall drops, harvests drop proportionally and almost immediately. These countries also have high rates of food insecurity in normal years, meaning that a disruption to the harvest pushes large portions of the population into crisis without much margin. Northeast Brazil is marked in every El Niño risk map as a drought target. The Sertão region, the same area devastated in 1877, is climatologically almost certain to receive below normal rainfall during a strong El Niño. Brazilian agricultural output has expanded enormously in the southern and central parts of the country, but the northeast remains vulnerable, and the communities there have less financial buffer against disruption than farming communities in wealthier countries. Australia's grain-growing regions in the southeast also face drought risk. The connection between Pacific warming and reduced rainfall in southeastern Australia is one of the most consistently documented El Niño relationships in the scientific record. What makes the 2026 risk picture particularly sobering is the overlap. All of these regions face elevated drought risk at the same time within the same 18-month window. In past events, not all of them were hit with equal severity. The 2026 forecast suggests an intensity that could push most of them into significant deficit simultaneously. Climate scientists use a term called compounding risk to describe this scenario. Individual risks are manageable. Compounded across multiple major food-producing and food-importing regions at the same time, they overwhelm the systems designed to handle them one at a time. The geography of the 2026 risk looks like 1877 drawn onto a modern map. El Niño does not just create drought, it is one of the strangest aspects of the phenomenon. The same ocean warming event that kills crops through drought in India and Australia simultaneously drowns communities in South America and California under catastrophic flooding. The reason comes back to the jet stream. During a strong El Niño, the jet stream over North America shifts from its normal position and locks into a more southern path across the continent. That shift channels Pacific storm systems into California and the American Southwest with unusual intensity and frequency. Storms that would normally pass north of San Francisco instead slam directly into the coast. California saw this in 1982. Flooding destroyed communities up and down the state. The 1997 did the same. In a state that cycles between drought and flood, El Niño years are reliably the flood years, sometimes severely so. Peru and Ecuador experience some of the most dramatic flooding associated with El Niño because the warming happens right on their doorstep. The coastal desert regions of Peru, normally among the driest places on Earth, can receive months of torrential rain during a strong El Niño. Rivers that were dry trenches fill to overflowing. Flash floods carve new channels through farming communities. Coastal infrastructure built for desert conditions fails entirely. The flooding in South America and North America happens while India, Australia, and East Africa bake. The same atmospheric reorganization creates opposite effects depending on where you are on the globe. Some regions get the surplus rain that others are starved of. This split creates a strange political and humanitarian problem. During the 1997, El Niño California was dealing with damaging floods. At the same time, Southern Africa was experiencing drought-driven famine risk. Resources and attention were split. The countries with political power were managing their own flood damage. The countries facing famine had to compete for international attention, while wealthier nations were focused inward. The flooding comes with its own death toll. In Peru during the 1997 event, floods killed hundreds of people and caused billions of dollars in damage. In the California floods of 1982 and 1997, communities were buried under mudslides. Infrastructure repairs took years. For the 2026 event, forecasters projected above normal flood risk for the Pacific coast of South America, parts of East Africa that experience unusual rainfall during El Niño, and portions of the American Southwest. At the same time, drought risk maps lit up across South Asia, Australia, and northeast Brazil. The split geography is not a paradox. It is the signature of how the ocean talks to the atmosphere, and the atmosphere reroutes water around the globe. Some places pay with too much, most pay with too little. The human cost on both sides of that divide is real, even if it looks completely different from one region to the next. Food prices tell a story that raw weather data cannot. They show how the physical reality of drought and flood translates into human suffering for people who never see a rain gauge. During the 1982 to 1983 El Niño, global grain prices rose sharply as production dropped in multiple countries simultaneously. The price of corn rose by around 20% on global commodity markets. Rice prices spiked in several Asian countries. For households in wealthy countries, those increases were an inconvenience, a few extra dollars at the grocery store. For households in low-income countries, a 20% rise in grain prices was a genuine emergency. The 1997 to 1998 El Niño produced a similar pattern. Food prices in affected countries rose significantly during the drought period. In Indonesia, the combination of El Niño drought and a currency crisis that happened at the same time sent food prices up by over 50% within months. A family that had been spending half its income on food was suddenly spending 3/4. Malnutrition rates in parts of Indonesia rose sharply during 1998. Children were the first to show the effects, as families cut portions and prioritized adults who were working. The 2007 to 2008 global food crisis, while not directly caused by a single El Niño event, showed what compounding stress looks like in the modern food system. Global grain prices roughly doubled between 2006 and 2008. Rice prices tripled at their peak. Food riots broke out in over 30 countries. Governments that had signed free trade agreements on food exports suddenly blocked exports to protect their own populations. The world food system, designed to operate on shared rules, fractured under pressure. El Niño events that hit multiple major producers in the same window can produce exactly that kind of compounding stress. The price signal that normally coordinates supply and demand globally stops working when the supply simply is not there. Buying more expensive food is only a solution if the food exists somewhere and you can afford it. The people most exposed to El Niño-driven price spikes are urban households in low-income countries who buy all their food. Farmers in drought-affected areas lose income and food simultaneously. Urban workers see only the price side, as their wages stay flat while food costs rise. Historical records from past El Niño events consistently show that the price shock outlasts the drought itself. Grain prices spiked in 1877, and in some regions stayed elevated for 2 to 3 years after the rains returned, because the supply chain had been disrupted for so long that it took years to rebuild. The same pattern appeared in 1998. The 2026 event's price impact depends entirely on how many producing regions are hit simultaneously and how severe the disruption is. Moderate disruption means notable but manageable price increases. Severe disruption across multiple major producers means something the world food system has not experienced in the modern era. The line between manageable and severe sits somewhere in the range of what the 2026 forecast was projecting. The fires of 2019 and 2020 in Australia burned an area roughly the size of the state of Washington. They killed over 3 billion animals. They blanketed Sydney in smoke so thick that air quality reached levels considered hazardous for everyone, including healthy adults. Australians called it the Black Summer, and it became one of the most widely covered environmental disasters of the 21st century. El Niño did not cause those fires directly. The 2019 event was a moderate El Niño, weaker than either 1982 or 1997, but its effect on Australian rainfall was enough to dry out vegetation across the southeast of the continent to levels that made a catastrophic fire season almost inevitable. The connection between El Niño and wildfire is straightforward once you understand what El Niño does to rainfall. When drought reduces precipitation across a region, plant life responds. Grasses dry out first, small shrubs lose moisture, larger vegetation draws down soil water reserves. After months of below normal rainfall, an entire landscape can become a potential fuel source, waiting for a spark. In Australia, El Niño years correlate strongly with increased wildfire frequency and severity. The data going back through the 20th century shows this pattern consistently. Strong El Niño years in Australia mean larger fires, faster spreading fires, and fires that are harder to contain because the humidity that normally slows fire spread is absent. The same relationship appears in California. El Niño brings floods in some years and reduces fuel loads through wet winters. But in the years following a wet El Niño winter, when that vegetation growth dries out in the summer, fire risk can increase. The relationship is more complicated than Australia's, but the link between Pacific Ocean temperature and California fire seasons runs through the same atmospheric system. In Southeast Asia, El Niño-driven drought creates conditions for catastrophic fires in Indonesia and Malaysia, where peatland fires can burn for months and release carbon at enormous rates. The 1997 fires in Indonesia, driven by that year's El Niño drought, burned for over a year and produced a smoke plume that affected hundreds of millions of people across the region. The 2026 El Niño forecast suggests elevated drought risk in Australia during the Southern Hemisphere spring and summer, which falls in the second half of 2026. Fire scientists watching the vegetation moisture data in Australian forests in mid-2026 were seeing indicators similar to the lead-up to previous severe fire seasons. A super El Niño in 2026 would not automatically cause catastrophic fires. Fire requires drought, fuel, and ignition. But El Niño consistently creates 2 of those 3 ingredients across multiple fire-prone regions simultaneously. The fires that follow a major El Niño drought are not separate disasters from the food crisis. They compound each other. Fires destroy farmland, They damage water catchments, they produce air quality conditions that harm crops and human health. They consume resources and attention that governments need for famine response. Every major El Niño event in the modern era has included a fire component. The 2026 event was shaping up to be no different. El Niño is one of the few things on Earth that actually reduces hurricane activity in the Atlantic. This surprises most people. When scientists describe El Niño as a disaster driver, the immediate assumption is that it makes all storms worse everywhere. The reality is stranger and more uneven. During El Niño years, stronger than normal upper atmosphere winds blow across the tropical Atlantic from west to east. These winds create what meteorologists call wind shear, which is when winds at different altitudes blow at different speeds or in different directions. Hurricanes are organized, spinning systems that need relatively consistent winds from the surface to the upper atmosphere to develop and maintain their structure. Wind shear tears them apart. In practical terms, this means that El Niño years often see fewer and weaker Atlantic hurricanes. The 1997 El Niño coincided with one of the quietest Atlantic hurricane seasons in decades. Forecasters expected suppression and got exactly that. The trade-off is that the same atmospheric changes that suppress Atlantic hurricanes tend to fuel more intense storm activity in the eastern Pacific. El Niño years often see more tropical storms and hurricanes off the Pacific coast of Mexico and Central America, hitting coastal regions that are less prepared for hurricane-force storms than the Gulf Coast of the United States. The other storm disruption El Niño creates is in the distribution of winter storms across North America. The shifted jet stream that channels Pacific storms into California also alters the storm track across the central and eastern United States. Some winters see dramatically more snow and ice in the southern states, which are poorly equipped for winter weather emergencies. Texas experienced a catastrophic winter storm failure in 2021, unrelated to El Niño, but illustrative of what happens when infrastructure designed for mild winters faces conditions it was never built to handle. In the western Pacific, El Niño shifts the zone where typhoons form further east. Typhoons that would normally track toward the Philippines and Vietnam form instead in open ocean and reach the coast at different locations or with different intensities than the historical average. Island communities and coastal cities built around an understanding of where storms typically come from can find themselves in the path of systems arriving from unexpected directions. The net global effect of El Niño on storms is a redistribution, not a simple increase or decrease. Some regions get more, some get less. The regions that get more are often those least prepared for it. The regions that get less sometimes rely on hurricane season rainfall for their water supply and experience the reduction as an unwelcome drought. The storm pattern shift adds one more layer to the already complex picture of what a super El Niño does to global conditions. Flooded coasts, drought interiors, wildfire-prone forests, disrupted supply chains, and now altered storm tracks, all running simultaneously, all demanding response from governments that can only focus on so many things at once. The 1877 famine was invisible until it had already killed millions. The 2026 El Niño was visible months before it reached full strength. That difference represents one of the most significant achievements in the history of applied science, and it is actively saving lives. International climate agencies began issuing formal El Niño advisories for the 2026 event in early spring, months before peak intensity was projected. Those advisories triggered specific response protocols in governments around the world. The protocols exist because of lessons learned from 1997, from 1982, and from studying 1877. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization activated its early warning monitoring system, tracking crop conditions across at-risk regions using satellite data. The system flags districts where vegetation health, which is a proxy for crop condition, is declining below normal. Those flags trigger field assessments and pre-positioning of food aid before the full scope of the shortage becomes undeniable. Several countries in southern Africa that received El Niño drought warnings in 2026 began seed distribution programs early, providing farmers with drought-tolerant crop varieties before the planting season. The same countries coordinated with the World Food Programme to pre-position emergency grain stocks in regional distribution hubs, cutting the response time needed if crop failures occurred. India activated its National Food Security Mission, with heightened monitoring requirements for rainfall and crop conditions across vulnerable states. The government had been building strategic grain reserves for several years after the painful lessons of earlier El Niño events. Those reserves provided a buffer to draw on if the monsoon underperformed. Australia's Bureau of Meteorology issued seasonal forecasts for farmers across the continent, providing detailed probability assessments for rainfall in each agricultural region. Farmers used those assessments to decide whether to plant, how much, and which varieties. Some chose to plant drought-resistant alternatives. Others held off on expensive inputs that would not pay off if rainfall came in below forecast. The United States Department of Agriculture issued global production forecasts that were updated monthly using satellite and ground-based data. Those forecasts fed into commodity markets, giving traders, governments, and food companies months of advance information about where global supply was likely to tighten. Scientists also focused specifically on the populations most at risk. Research teams mapped food insecurity indicators, household income data, and drought exposure simultaneously to identify the communities where moderate crop failure could tip quickly into crisis. Those maps guided where international food aid organizations pre-positioned resources. The gap between what science could do in 2026 and what it could do in 1877 is almost incomprehensible. The preparation being made in 2026 will save millions of lives compared to a 1877 style response. The question scientists were asking honestly was whether that preparation would be enough if the event reached its projected peak intensity. That question does not yet have a final answer. This is the question researchers argue about most intensely, and the honest answer involves genuine scientific uncertainty alongside some deeply concerning emerging evidence. The basic relationship between climate change and El Niño is not simple. El Niño has existed for thousands of years. It operated during ice ages and warm periods long before humans began altering the atmosphere. The phenomenon is rooted in the physical interaction between the Pacific Ocean and the atmosphere above it, a system that has its own internal variability independent of global warming. What climate change does is add a layer of additional energy to that system. The global ocean is warming, not just the surface, but the upper 1,000 feet where El Niño events actually operate. That warming is measurable and documented. The average temperature of the world's oceans has risen significantly over the past century, and the rate of warming has accelerated in recent decades. When El Niño develops in a warmer baseline ocean, it starts from a higher temperature floor. The same atmospheric dynamics that produce a 3-degree warming spike in the pre-industrial Pacific now produce that 3-degree spike on top of an ocean that is already 1 degree warmer than it was a century ago. The peak temperature reached is higher. The heat discharged into the atmosphere is greater. The downstream effects on weather patterns are stronger. Some climate models project that warming the global ocean pushes El Niño events toward more extreme peaks. The events may not become more frequent, but when they occur, the ceiling on their intensity rises. The strongest events get stronger. Other models suggest a different outcome, that warming could change the background state of the Pacific in ways that alter when and how El Niño forms, potentially changing the frequency. The science on frequency is genuinely uncertain, with models producing a range of outcomes that have not yet converged on a clear direction. What is less uncertain is the compounding effect. A super El Niño in a world that is already warmer produces drought conditions against a background that was already drier than average in many regions. It produces flood conditions against a background where extreme rainfall events have already become more common. The El Niño disruption stacks on top of changes that were already stressing the same agricultural systems. Scientists who study this compounding effect describe it as loading the dice. El Niño has always been a high-stakes role. Climate change loads the dice further towards the extreme outcomes. The 1877 event happened in a cooler world. The 2026 event is happening in a world roughly 2 degrees Fahrenheit warmer on average. That background warmth does not change the fundamental mechanics of El Niño. It changes the playing field on which El Niño operates. The emerging evidence suggests that the upper bound of what El Niño can do is moving upward alongside global temperatures. The question of how far it can go, and how fast, is one that researchers are actively working to answer. 50 million people died. A single ocean warming event. No weapons, no war, no disease arriving from outside. Just a shift in the Pacific that rewired the atmosphere and starved the rain away from half the world. The 1877 famine is the most important climate event most people have never heard of. It is the proof of concept for what a destabilized global weather system can do to human civilization, and it is the single clearest historical argument for why the El Niño forming in 2026 deserves the full attention of every government, every food agency, and every person who eats food that was grown somewhere other than their own backyard. The lesson from 1877 is not simply that El Niño is dangerous. History is full of dangerous events. The lesson is about the gap between the warning signs and the response. Henry Blandford saw the pressure reading shift in April 1877. He flagged it. He sent dispatches. Nobody acted with the urgency the data demanded. By the time political leaders accepted the scale of what was happening, millions of people were already dying. The gap between the signal and the response was the mechanism through which 50 million deaths became possible. The drought was the cause. The delayed response was the multiplier. In 1877, that delay was partly unavoidable. There were no satellites. There were no ocean buoys. There was no global forecast model running on computers that can simulate the atmosphere thousands of times overnight. Blandford was doing the best that human knowledge and technology allowed in his era, and it was not enough. In 2026, the signal arrived months early. The monitoring systems worked exactly as designed. The forecasts were issued. The warnings were clear. The question that 1877 leaves on the table is whether the response in 2026 matches the warning in the way that 1877's response never could. The 1877 famine also revealed something about how political systems behave under food stress. Grain continued leaving India while people died. Colonial governments applied economic philosophy to a humanitarian crisis. Decisions made thousands of miles away by people who were not hungry determined whether people who were dying received help. That dynamic has not disappeared. In 2026, the countries most at risk of severe food disruption are also the countries with the least political power in global institutions. The decisions that will determine whether the 2026 El Niño kills thousands or millions will be made mostly by governments and organizations in wealthy countries that will themselves face manageable disruption, not existential food crisis. The 1877 event is a mirror. It reflects what happens when the most powerful natural climate force on Earth runs into a world unprepared for it. The preparation is better in 2026. The warning systems are dramatically better. The food systems have more resilience. But the ocean does not grade on a curve. It does not reduce its intensity because the world has more infrastructure than it had 150 years ago. The Pacific warming in 2026 will reach whatever peak the physics of the ocean and atmosphere produce. The outcome depends on what the world built in the time it had, and whether the response matches the warning. 50 million people in 1877 had no forecast, no early warning, no preparation time. The world in 2026 has all three. What happens next is a choice.